webinar panel discussion. So Dr. Carlie Trott is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cincinnati, where she heads the Collaborative Sustainability Lab and advises students in the Community and Organizational Research for Action PhD program. Dr. Trott's climate justice research agenda aims to bring visibility to and work against the inequitable impacts of climate change socially and geographically. As a social psychologist by training and community psychologist in practice, Trott's work aims to center the voices and actions of those most affected by environmental injustice and the climate crisis, and often involves community engaged, participated, and action oriented research methods. Her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and Bloomberg Philanthropies. Her research has been published in the journals of Sustainability Science, Action Research, Local Environmental, Education Research, Studies in Higher Education, Journal of Social and Political Psychology, and many others. Dena Arya is a member of the Iranian diaspora who has worked in the UK as a youth and community practitioner for over 15 years. Dena's research interest in youth policy stemmed from the early days of global financial crisis in 2008. Since this time, in her practice with young people, she has witnessed the developing socioeconomic pressures and climate injustice they face and how they navigate thus, in the politics, her research interests include intersectionality, the political economy of youth, eco-socialism, and climate activism. Her current research focuses on youth participatory action research with young people from global majority communities to develop climate justice education tools. Dena is currently a research associate at the University of Pretoria, South Africa, and is also a youth personnel development coach and works with the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health UK to support youth to have voice in health policy making. Stephanie Lam, MA, they is an Asian American doctoral candidate of the community psychology. She's training with the Community and Organizational Research for Action program in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cincinnati, Ohio, USA. Stephanie's current research focuses on the intersection of racial and climate injustice. Specifically, she focuses on recording the experiences and perspectives of BIPOC youths who engage in climate justice actions. Her work process takes in the form of collaboration with ingredients are co-collaboration, fluid negotiation, and creative processes. Stephanie strives to create space of care, creativity, and collaboration in whatever project she is engaging with. She is currently a board member serving as the secretary of the Community Engagement Collective and community-based nonprofit organization serving Cincinnati communities. She's currently assisting in building a coalition of BIPOC mental health directory in Cincinnati to help bridge the gap for Cincinnati BIPOC to find a mental health provider. And Rupinder Grewal is a Punjabi Canadian and a recent Master of Education graduate from the Lakefield University. Her thesis focuses on centering the voices of Black, Indigenous, and racialized youth across in the climate justice movement. Drawing from her experience, she conducted qualitative research study with 15 youth from marginalized communities engaged in climate activism. Her work illuminated these stories, highlighting not only the racism and oppression they faced, but also showcasing the resilience and leadership in navigating these challenges and creating opportunities for fellow youth activists. Rupinder is a high school teacher with a passion for social justice, intersectionality, and youth activism. She has taught in schools in Canada and Thailand and has contributed significantly to equity-focused initiatives as curriculum specialist with Ontario's Education Television Network, TVO, firmly believing in the transformative power of storytelling. Rupinder continues to explore the complexities of life while advocating for meaningful change in education and beyond. So that is our amazing presenters, and I will hand over to the panelist, Dr. Carlie Trott, to take over. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining and presenters for being here.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us. To get things started, I just want to go over our plans for today. And so instead of doing a presentation with slides and kind of going over research and findings, our idea was to present to you a panel discussion focused on the role of the researcher in intersectional climate justice relationships. So we have 5 sections of questions we're going to go through with the panel related to stories into doing climate justice activism related research, a little about methods and what we expect from research, as well as the role of the researcher and reflecting on our role and the realms of bringing activism and academia together. And so to make it a bit interactive, what we're going to do is I will go through some reflection prompts, and I encourage the audience to just think through briefly what your responses to these questions would be. We won't have an opportunity to share with each other, but I want to get you into the mindset of each of the sections of the panel first from your own perspective, and then I will ask the panel to respond to a question. So the first section is about stories into climate justice activism research, thinking about how did we get here? And so the questions that I encourage the audience to think through briefly are, what brought you here today? And what interests you about today's panel? And what are the events in your life that landed you in this Teams room today? And now I'm going to ask the panel to please introduce yourself, give a little bit of background, and tell your story into youth climate justice activism research. And so let's start with Dena, and then we'll go to Rupinder and then Stephanie.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Carlie. A really pleasure to be here and to be in conversation with the panel and hopefully with the audience who are with us too. So what brought me to climate justice research? Well, I started my journey as a youth worker in 2008 during the Great Financial Crash, as it's now called. And in those years, as a young person myself doing youth work, I was also heavily involved in social justice action. Struggled to use the word activism, but one of my co-panelists can talk us through that in a moment. And so I was doing all these really separate things, right? I was interested and cared about water rights, about land rights, about education issues, issues around poverty, issues around police injustice, issues of racism. And all these things felt very separate. All these causes, all these struggles that we were a part of felt very separate. And it wasn't until I found the concept of climate justice that I realized that all these things that I thought I was doing separately actually had a common thread and lived together and were housed together under one struggle. So I guess I was always doing it without knowing, and now I have the language to be able to explain how it all fits. I'm going to hand over to Rupinder, if that's okay.
Thanks, Dena. So I'm a high school educator where I teach sciences and social sciences, mainly to grade 9 and grade 10 students. And so I got my Bachelor of Education in 2020. And during that time in Thunder Bay, Ontario, there were also some Fridays for Future climate strikes happening in my local area. And so I attended them because they were being organized by some of my professors as well. And so when I attended, I was really amazed by just how many youth were showing up. And At the time, I remember going on Twitter and also seeing a video by Vanessa Nakate, and where she was speaking about her experience of being cropped out of the image by the Associated Press, where she was attending the World Economic Forum in Switzerland, and she was beside four other white youth activists at the time, and she got cropped out. And I was thinking more about that because it really struck me, and I was thinking, how many other youth of color activists are there out there that are doing tremendous work in climate justice, but don't get that kind of same spotlight or are being included in the broader movement. And so that's what led me to doing my master's research titled By No Means the Area, Centering the Voices of Black, Indigenous, and Youth of Color Climate Activists on Ontario. And so I utilized timeline mapping and semi-structured interviews, and I heard stories from participants across Ontario talking about their experiences and challenges in the movement. And I'll pass it on to Stephanie.
Thank you. How did I get into climate justice? Well, I accidentally fell into it as well. A couple years back, I was working on racial justice issues and health justice issues in the West Coast of the United States. And there were a lot of things that were coming into place when I was thinking about, well, all these social issues are connected. There's like an ecosystem of social issues, and they just compound into many things that impacts people's health and well-being, depending on like who they are, what location they're residing in, and if they're in a big city or if they're in a rural area. And then thinking about how I fell into climate work was when I applied to grad school, having a conversation with my future advisor at the time. The consideration was, wow, climate justice is like a mega monster that helps connect all of these intersecting social issues, which is something I've been very curious about at the time. And yeah, that's how I got in there. And now I'm working on racial justice work with climate justice now, hopefully. So yeah, Carlie.
Yeah, thanks everybody for sharing. I just wanted to kind of give a little bit more of a backdrop on how this all came together. So the four of us presenting today actually just connected really organically around these common interests in youth climate justice activism, the perspectives specifically of marginalized youth around the world, and we're just having open conversations and meeting a few times to talk through some of these ideas before the panel opportunity came up. And so we got the chance to meet and talk openly about some of these ideas. And I think it's important to just think through all of the angles and the different ways of coming at this work. That's just, there's so many entrance points. And so getting into the second topic of today's panel, we're thinking about sort of this broad framing of research in climate justice activism, working with youth, and a bit about labeling and terminology. So audience reflection questions, I want you to think a little bit about what is an activist and how do you define activism? And when you think of an activist, what associations come up for you? Are there particular images, emotions, sensations, colors that arise? Do you consider yourself to be an activist? And the last question is it possible that other people might see you as an activist, even though maybe you don't identify yourself as one? And with that, I'm going to turn to the panel. And this time we're going to start with a particular panelist and then kind of get into shorter responses from the other two. We'll do that for the next few questions. So we're going to start with Rupinder on this one. And the question is, why is it important to think about activist self-identification? And what are we potentially overlooking if we assume that people call themselves activists?
Thanks, Carlie. So the term activist, when I think about it, it's a highly contested term with different, constructed meanings, depending on things like historical and cultural usage. And so when I think of activism in its simplest form, it involves working in some kind of capacity to create and push for, political, economic, environmental, and social change. And that could include collective behaviors ranging from things like very low risk passive acts to high risk and active behaviors. And so in the context of the youth climate justice movement, understanding activist self-identification specifically is important for many reasons. And one of the main ones that comes to my mind is inclusivity and representation, especially diverse representation. So we know that not all individuals who contribute to climate justice identify as activists. So some may see themselves as concerned citizens, students, researchers, community organizers, and so forth. So by assuming everybody calling themselves activists, we risk overlooking the contributions of those who participate in different capacities. And so even from the viewpoint of youth from marginalized communities, they might engage in climate justice work, but might not identify as, activists due to cultural, social, or political reasons. For example, during my master's research, some participants had mentioned that, their parents saw protesting or climate strikes as being too radical, or their parents coming from places like war-torn countries like Sierra Leone, for example, where, protesting is strictly forbidden or seen as illegal. So youth, that was one of the hindrances, or being afraid of, repercussions of participating in things like climate strikes and then being labeled as an activist. So identifying as an activist itself can carry like a very heavy and emotional, psychological burden almost, especially because of the confrontational nature of activism of that sort. And so there are many different kinds of labels that you could put to activists, including things like intersectional environmentalist is one of the words that came up a lot in my research, because it's a lot more broader and more encompassing of the different social identities that activists identify with, right? And it's more broader. And so one of the participants had said that they saw themselves as an aspiring accomplice instead. And so when we're thinking about, only considering self-identified activists in research, we may miss a large segment of youth who are involved in climate justice work. And this may lead to incomplete understanding of the movement's dynamics on a broader scale.
I love that. I feel like I'm learning concepts and terms today. I wrote down Omega Monster from Stephanie, which I just love. I'd never heard that before. And I was like, thank you. I'm keeping that on my post-it forever. And aspiring accomplice too. I just wanted to add, Rupinder, to what you were saying, and what you made me think about some of my own research participants and this issue around labeling and activism that came up, both for those who did see themselves as activists, but also those who did not. And it's this thing about the enoughness of it, in the sense that, if I'm not labeled an activist, if you don't see me as an activist, well, is it because you don't think that what I'm doing is enough or good enough? Or on the other hand, others not wanting to be labeled as an activist for feeling that what they were doing was not enough. And so this like self-responsibilizing to the point where they felt that because they might buy from fast fashion, or not recycle everything in the way that they could, or that they couldn't then give themselves that that label. So yeah, really really useful hearing that from you. And I love again that term, aspiring accomplice.
Stephanie?
Mega monster is not a scientific term. It just came out the way it did. But yeah, similar thoughts about the label of activism. Like, well, my thoughts went to, what does labels do? Do they limit something? Do they amplify something? Or is it gatekeeping? Because a lot of those things come into factor when we're using labels, and I'm just thinking like this is like generally, and with like people's personal lives, like what does, my questions are always like, what does that label mean to them? And if does that promote any risk? Does it mean something for their family? Does it mean something for their well-being? Is it individualized or anything else like that?
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, leading up to this panel, we had been talking about all of the complexity related to this really important decision. And when we're thinking about research around climate justice activism, I think it's really maybe easy to overlook some of these really important considerations. It seems really simple to think, oh, I'm just going to be doing research on climate justice activism, but what are the implications of glossing over the complexities of how people engage with this term and this label for themselves, and thinking through, what counts as activism versus, doing climate justice work or taking action for climate justice, and so on. So getting into the third section of the panel, we're getting into the doing the research part now, sort of some of the methodological considerations for doing climate justice work. And so I encourage the audience to reflect on, what does climate justice mean to you? And what kinds of research could serve to advance climate justice? And with that, I'm going to ask Stephanie to get us started on this question. What's important about dealing with climate justice in your work, not just climate change? And what's important to think about when choosing methods for working on climate justice?
For me, it's almost like, not almost, sitting with all the complexities and nuances, and at the same time keeping humanity as well. I don't think I said that quite eloquently, but like I feel like we have, not I feel like, I think there we have a lot of methods out there, whether or not it is classified as a method in your textbooks, or it's something you learned from your grandmother growing up or your aunties. And to build community, to center people's lives. And when it comes to climate justice, that is it. It's livelihood, living, and not just living, but like living well, and how do we make sure our neighbors and people across the world can be connected and living well. And that's like the climate justice umbrella portion for me. Climate change is more of the scientific, not scientific phenomena, but like what makes up climate change. And with it objectively by itself, like it is just an entity, but connecting it with the relevance to you is important. And then choosing a method with the varieties that we have, everything has a place, which is something that we discussed last week. Like everything has a place, and using it to serve a purpose, even if it's small, can help, because there has been a legacy that created climate change. And there is a legacy for climate change resistance, or like climate justice, and it's tapping into that, and building off of like what ancestors have protected and given us today. So that was very big ideas. I don't know how to bring that back down to earth, so I'm gonna need some help.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say much. I love that part around community, right? And it's about community building. And I suppose that what I'm hearing and what is resonating for me in what you were saying is about, the climate justice research, the work of doing that kind of research is building community and being involved in transformation with co-researchers, youth co-researchers, and learning from all the traditions that all the different people involved bring with them to that space, right? And so we could do research that looked at the political economy of youth in climate issues, and look at the structural issues, and look at capitalism, look at all these large social problems. But I think the difference between that kind of work that looks at what got us here, the social and structural issues that got us here, the difference between climate justice work and that is the transformation bit, the community building bit. And I think that's so important. Even when we're thinking about, what is activism, is climate justice research in of itself a form of activism? I don't have an answer to that question, but I'll bat that back to the group.
Stephanie, I really liked how you spoke to the human-centeredness and well-being part of it, because I feel like when we're thinking about even designing research and methodology and all that kind of stuff, we tend to get stuck in very rigid guidelines, even though we're working for for example, semi-structured, we're thinking about open-ended interview questions and things like that. But I think when we're going through for example, interviews, it could be very healing for participants as well, and the communities that they are a part of. And so that healing process is really important in terms of what kind of outcomes and things like that happen out of climate justice work. And so it is very empowering for participants, but also communities as well.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to mention, since I didn't do this earlier, that we're going to save some time at the end for Q&A. So we're getting into the fourth of five questions for the panel. So feel free to pop questions that you have throughout the session into the chat, and we can jump right into those for our last 10 minutes or so. So getting into this, you know what? I just wanted to reflect on that a little bit first on this panel. Leading up to this, we had conversations about climate justice and youth activism research and methods, and shared all kinds of, interesting methods with each other, like conversations with a purpose and participatory, qualitative interviews. We all share an interest in arts-based methodologies and thinking about intergenerational relationships and support structures in youth climate justice work, as well as the idea of intragenerational diversity and understanding that youth and young people is not a homogenous group, right? And so kind of thinking about that and bringing it into the fourth section of the panel, we're transitioning now into the idea of research outcomes or research for systems change. And so I encourage the audience to think through a couple of reflection questions. And the first one is, what is research for? And what is changed by your research? And how can the world change through research? We're getting into theories of change here. And so we're going to start with Dena on this one. And the question for the panel is, when you think about research outcomes in work with youth climate justice activists, what comes to mind? How do you think about research outcomes or the impact of research?
Yeah, I mean, it depends who I'm talking to. When I think about this question, I've been writing a lot of research grant applications, and certainly there's a certain way of talking about outcomes and outputs, and the way that we frame that to these large institutions. But I think for me and for many of the climate justice researchers, particularly those who work with young people that I know, sometimes we're trying to shoehorn social justice work into these really archaic, grants applications. I hope, grants people are listening in on this. In terms of what it's for, what is that output for? For me, and I'll just speak about, what it is from my heart, is that, it's about developing the skills and the capacities and the capabilities of our youth co-researchers, what they decide to do with that, how they decide to shape their realities, tell their stories, be a part of community building is really their decision. It's our job to be a part of that capacity building and empowering and supporting as collaborators. And also to think about, well, whose benefit is that research for? When we think about outputs and outcomes, for whose benefit? If it's first for our youth co-researchers, then for our youth co-researchers and their communities, and then the wider community. I think in my own experience, I have learned so much from my youth co-researchers and have benefited so much in ways that I didn't go out looking to be benefited by, if that makes sense. I've certainly become a more nuanced and more understanding human because of my youth co-researchers and because of their complex ways of seeing the world. And then finally, the institutions, the ref score funding bodies, and these outputs, these outcomes, I think are last, even though maybe in our funding proposals they come first. So I think there's a hierarchy, let's say, of who is supposed to benefit from the outputs and outcomes, whatever they are, and that they should be governed by the youth co-researchers themselves. But I'm curious to hear other people's views. I'm just going to back to the group.
Thanks, Dena. I agree with you because I think I feel like when we're thinking about outcomes, like I'm thinking more about the practical and tangible like benefits of youth participants, because I feel like as much as like through that research process and interviewing, I benefited just as much hearing their stories from it. So it wasn't just like, healing for them. I remember one of my participants saying, this was so therapeutic after like that interview. And I was like, I feel the same way. And it's like that shared connection, that building, that practical, tangible benefit of just being in that moment and talking to each other about it. I feel like that's very powerful in of itself. And so the other part of it, as putting my educator hat on it, is thinking about like policy and accessible, like how do we make research more accessible, right? And we're thinking about things like storytelling and documentation to like people creating documentaries about kind of like research, based off of climate justice work. And so I'm thinking more about accessibility and even like the curriculum design part of it and pushing policy so that, the research outcomes of what youth actually want in their education to be implemented into policy so that they're actually learning about what they want to learn about. And so that's what I think of when I'm thinking about research outcomes for climate justice. And I'll pass it to Stephanie.
Thank you, Rupinder. I also agree with the almost like giving research away for free, or like giving psychology away for free. That's something like community psychologists talk about a lot. Giving away psychology for free, so the issue no longer exists, working yourself out of a job. And I think like the grand outcome that I think maybe everybody would like is that climate change issues no longer exist. We work ourselves all the way there and say, oh, poof, it's gone. But it's going to take a long, long time. And it's not, and hopefully the skills and the processes or like the methods of research can be given to folks, not just given, but like there is a shared language of this inquiry, not just scientific inquiry, but even in the form that is less quote unquote informal, not in the university, so people can be in community and work on local social issues that would directly or indirectly contribute to a future of, climate just futures, whatever that would look like in the localized area is the dream, because it's like an ecosystem of issues, ecosystem of, work and solutions.
Yeah, this
Really.
is all reminding me of my own research when I worked with young people on climate action in local settings. And, I'm looking at the impacts of the program and using surveys and focus groups and reading through transcripts. And one of my research goals was to just understand how working collaboratively on climate in community settings had impacted young people's sense of agency. And I remember kind of reflecting on my own sort of role as a researcher and writing through and, trying to practice reflexivity, and also just kind of like finalizing sort of my statement and positionality in writing. And something that occurred to me was how much the research process really expanded my own sense of agency in facilitating youth participatory work. I felt like it changed me as a researcher to kind of see possibilities in all of this collaborative work and listening to young people sort of reflect on their experiences. And so when we think about outcomes, sometimes we don't think about it, for ourselves, as researchers, but we are and can be, changed through the research process. And I'm definitely a different researcher because of the work I've done in this area. So thinking through some of those relational dimensions, I think, is really important. So getting into our final section here. And that was a really great segue. It's focused on reflecting on our role as researchers and the spheres of academia and activism, which are often so separate. And maybe how could we integrate these spheres? And so audience reflection questions, I ask you to think about, well, we asked earlier about your activist identification in general. And now I'm just going to ask you to consider, do you think of yourself as a scholar activist? And why or why not? And the last question is, should we and how can we integrate these spheres of academia and activism? And so I'm going to bring this to the full panel. We'll go in the same order as last time. How about Dena and then Rupinder and then Stephanie? How do you think about the role of the researcher in work with youth climate justice activists? Do we need to unlearn and reimagine ways of conducting research, and how so?
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit about what Sarah added in the chat about amplifying young people's voices, and that being our starting point, as what is our role as researchers, and thinking about, the collaboration, the co-struggle, but that ultimately in that, what is that? What is the mechanism of amplifying voice? And I was starting to think about like us as microphones as a tool, right? And that if we're here to broker, to extract funds from institutions, from grant bodies, and to then develop the capacities of our youth co-researchers and to empower and to support them, and ideally to get out of their way, right? Like if we're amplifying their voice, we're not in that. We're kind of more a Well, I think the only word I can think of is microphone now. I had an image in my mind, but I can't explain it. I was also thinking about, what colors and what images come to mind. One of those first questions you asked, Carlie. But yeah, I think that for me is it. We're brokers and we're supposed to get out of the way and do a lot of the building block work in between. Over to the rest of the team.
I love the use of the word broker that you use. I was thinking the terms facilitator, collaborator, and then advocate and ally more than like scholar activist. I think the term facilitator sort of gives them that guidance, but then lets them have that agency and that, the empowerment of their own work and being able to, not be forced into a certain way of doing things. And so when you're a facilitator, you're more just on the guidelines or the periphery of the research, if that makes any sense. But that's what I think of when we're, thinking about the role of the researcher in climate justice and just making sure that, we're thinking about like, I guess it sort of speaks to what Carlie spoke about in terms of reflexivity and, the power dynamics that usually exist between like the researcher and then the participant or the interviewee, for example. But when you're more collaborators and co-creators, it changes that dynamics and it flips it around. And so that's sort of what I would see the future of climate justice research work looking more like.
To me, sometimes just to add is to also bear witness to and recognize when there are people missing. And that's something that Dena, Rupinder, Carlie, and I work on. We notice the people who are missing and to record those experiences and not just amplify, but like amplify in a way that is legitimate in the scientific realm because that could potentially, hopefully, push for policies and like push for funding and things like that so other folks could tap in to the literatures we write and validate that experience as well, especially for a lot of marginalized youth. They tend to be unseen and unheard just because the way the dominant narrative is telling the story about what climate change is, who is in the front lines of climate change activism, and then thinking about looking back in history with the historians and all that, and even in the civil rights movement in the United States, there has been very clear key figures, and even today there has been stories being told about there are other people that have pushed these key figures up. And part of the research that I feel like all of us are doing is getting at the other people who are just in their daily lives, working in the incremental, movement and change, who are just like regular folks who are not up at these podiums. Carlie.
Oh, sorry. Could I just add on to that? It made me think of one of the participants who spoke about how whenever she's speaking to news outlets or doing some kind of interview, she doesn't want to get painted as a perfect activist and that she wants agency over her own story. But then she also spoke about how there's usually so much doubt placed on the knowledge that they have as youth and then as youth of color. And so when that doubt is placed, it they internalize that too. But then how do you, when she took part of this, my master's research, she was like, this is so validating in a way because it's breaking free of that doubt and acknowledging that I do have that knowledge and things like that. You know what I mean? And so that's sort of what I got thinking about when Stephanie, you were talking about that. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things about thinking through the role of the researcher is to just be open to that kind of feedback process in collaboration with the youth and community groups and things where we might not need to come into the situation knowing exactly what our role is, right? We might be able to learn about what the needs are and what the skill sets that we can use or apply in the service of the goals of the group are going to be without kind of knowing that in advance. And I think it's so important to just kind of maybe suspend the assumptions in advance about the role of the researcher. And this reminds me of something that came up in a couple of attendees today. Brendan Barnes and Maria Fernandez-Jesus and I were collaborating with Garrett Barnwell on a research article, and just talking about kind of imagining the role of doing work with communities for climate justice and what that looks like. And I remember Garrett Barnwell saying something to this effect, where it's about kind of being open to what that role can be and not necessarily understanding the exact shape of it right from the get-go. And that just seems important to reflect on, because I think a lot of the time as researchers, we think, well, these are the skills and knowledge that I bring. Here's how I can orchestrate or facilitate something where the outcomes are known in advance. And a lot of that is encouraged by our academic systems and structures that, with whether it's grant proposals or ethics review committees and protocols, that we have to kind of chart everything out like a blueprint from the beginning. And those of us who do participatory work know that that's really hard to put together if we're trying to be open in that way. But maybe there needs to be some systems change on the academic side too, to be more attentive to what this kind of collaborative work can look like and how to make it more possible for researchers to engage in. So with that.
All right. I was just going to jump in because you reminded me of a moment that I had. You reminded me of this, and the invitation, right, of taking on roles when asked, and when invited to by research participants and co-researchers. I was reflecting on I was doing ethnography with a youth climate strike group for a year. And in those very early stages, I was very careful about not giving my opinion or not sharing too much about what I thought, taking up too much space, and also thinking through things as a youth worker and being like, no, like it's their space, let them find their voice, and coming at it with that perspective. But then one day, when asked what I thought about something, I said, well, it depends on what you think. And there was a moment where actually I got told, where the young person went, well, actually, you're here with us and you're a youth climate striker. You're one of us. So actually your opinion does matter and what you think does count, and we want to hear it. And so thinking about participation and being in collaboration also means, like others, you stake your claim, you say your piece, and you are part of whatever it is that you're creating together. So yeah, anyway, you brought that back to me. It was a good reminder that we're not always supposed to be brokers and get out the way. Sometimes we're invited to participate, which is what we need to do.
Absolutely. And I think I'll end with one last story, because this came up in our initial conversations about this. Is sometimes we think we know exactly what kind of research needs to be done. And so we say, oh, we want to do this participatory work and so on, and we're going to do this collaborative, whatever. And then it was, this is part of going back to the climate justice symposium that happened at the University of Johannesburg last summer that I co-organized with Brendan Barnes and Maria Fernandez-Jesus and Garrett Barnwell. Garrett was talking about doing this big survey with a community that was facing extractive industry and health impacts and being displaced and all kinds of just really kind of horrific treatment from big companies. And so as a psychologist, as somebody who is open to kind of learning what needs to happen and what would be most helpful, I feel like it's easy to discount some like large scale kind of top down survey measures and everything. And he was talking about how actually it was the most important thing to go and gather up all of this, quantitative data and sort of deliver that as part of process to seek, litigation and real kind of change in the community. And so I think kind of being open to meeting the needs where they are, kind of shape shifting to address those things, bringing your skill set in the service of communities is really valuable. So with that, let's spend our last few minutes going through questions. And anybody who's here in the audience that has a comment or a question, feel free to enter those into the chat.
We got one. Plato. I'm sorry if I butchered your name. One of the things I keep asking myself is, am I doing enough to contribute to the climate change movement? What does it take to finally call oneself a climate change activist? Besides a long-term commitment to use a bamboo toothbrush.
And we talked about this, right? In some of our initial conversations. When do you get to that threshold? What does it mean to claim that? I don't think there's one easy answer to it.
I want to point to the question, am I doing enough to change, to contribute? I think, and this is like, ooh, I think we're all enough to contribute, like being here, resisting in any shape or form, whether it's learning about the movement, contributing to the movement in a small way, or even talking to people is enough. It takes a whole community, it takes a whole like ecosystem, it takes a whole tapping into a whole legacy to work on climate change and feeling like, and this is also a message to myself, feeling like you're not enough is always going to be something that we're going to be battling with, because the timing is going, and everything is, so yeah, it's all that, and find your people.
Yeah. I think it's really, really important that we don't get into this neoliberal individual trap of I'm not good enough, right? And if we think about our actions, our activities as individual, we can quite quickly feel lost and hopeless. And I think for me, something that my co-researchers really taught me and helped me understand was that you do what you can where you can, and that all those different practices, from the everyday to the minute to the magnificent, are all worthy and part of that contribution, right? And if we think about things from a place of relationality, if we think about movements, groups, relationships, intergenerational processes that we are all a part of, then it stops being so much about what I did today as what we are all doing together progressively. And the work of John Holloway, like Crack Capitalism, it's not what you think, but the title kind of is a bit skew, but he really, really helped me to find that okayness with, sometimes if all I'm doing is reading, that's okay. And yeah, I wonder if there's anything others have read or just ways of being that help them to kind of deal with this not good enoughness, because it does come up, right?
All the time.
I can respond, and then we have another great question. So I was just going to say, one thing that came to mind for me was just navigating what Dena was talking about, this neoliberal approach, which is that, the best what we can do is all these individual behavior changes, lifestyle, consumer stuff, and whatever. I've been kind of grappling with that in my work from the very beginning, because so much of the climate change and psychology literature had been about what someone with the last name Shove that I read. It was one of the earlier articles was about ABC's attitudes, behaviors, I forget what the C was. And it was, but it was all about this. We need to move beyond this and we need to think broader. But I think it's both. We need systems change, but I wrote a paper about this on youth and action and it was about this idea of cultural change where we there is the bottom up stuff, there is the individual action stuff too. It's like our mindsets, our relationships, our what we are, how we are constructing our lives and so on, and kind of there's a little bit of kind of interaction between those as well. And so I think it's important to be critical of those messages that the only thing you can do are these kind of smaller things that really add up, the small steps approach. There's more. We need more than that, but we need both. So let me read through this next question. I'm not sure if it's relevant. However, if there's any advice on how to navigate the literature gap. As a novice researcher focused on intersectionality and climate change in psychology, for example, climate anxiety in the global south, would sincerely appreciate it. I'll just say, if you're finding that where you're working doesn't have a lot of the research that you're looking for, then the work that you're doing is incredibly important. And I found when I was dealing with this in my own early work with youth and climate change, and the only stuff that was out there was classroom-based stuff rather than collaborative, action-oriented stuff, I would cling on to the articles that seemed the most relevant, and then also go to methods research as well, which can help you to justify kind of a different approach, even if it's not on the particular topic. Others?
I remember when I was
Rupinder,
doing my literature review, and at the time I couldn't find a lot on when I was typing into like Google Scholar, for example, youth of color climate justice activists. And so when I was doing that, I also looked into the gray literature too, because it could be so relevant and could give you new ideas of what to search for and like keywords and things like that. So there's a lot out there, not just in terms of finding the literature gap, but also using gray literature and websites and things like that outside of scholarly journal articles that could help you find those gaps.
And also thinking about what you contribute, right? Your positionality, the way that you bring your perspective to that research. So it may be that there isn't a, the gap that everybody is looking for, but what is it that you bring that adds to, that is a contribution to, and in that way, that is bringing something new. And so you can flip that gap as an addition rather than a, it doesn't exist. It's there is nobody other than you that can bring your perspective to that particular topic. And in that way, you'll always be adding something new.
I'm having that frustration right now with the literature gap. But then I found Dena's and Rupinder's work. What I'm leaning on right now is like the historical patterns when it comes to oppression, and leaning hard on intersectionality work, leaning hard on those theoretical framework to kind of think about, okay, so these are the things that I'm seeing missing. How can I use the framework to say, like, the things that are missing are loud and clear and they need to not be missing, things like that. So we could talk more. Hit us up.
well, I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I think that's our hour. So thank you everyone for joining us today. This has been really excellent, a great discussion. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to Fatima for inviting us to be here today.
Nice. So from the CEPD, we would just really like to say thank you for the amazing presentations. I think that the way in which you had presented this particular panel discussion really facilitated understanding the complexity of the work and the need to think through what it is that you're doing. I found it really beautiful listening to your stories and that you were able to validate each other and also validate for people in the audience that you are enough and that you can go out and use yourself as a tool for change with the people in the community. I loved that idea that collaborative research doesn't mean you're absent. You actually have to be present to work with other people. And from the whole discussion, what I also was thinking was, it's actually quite beautiful to have a young person be endeared by you as somebody that does have power. And I think it's that engagement and validation that the researcher and the person that you're engaging with brings together that really makes a difference. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you so much. It's been beautiful. If you have any articles or links to articles that you'd like to drop for us in the chat, please do so. I have put at the start of the chat our Facebook webpage. So you can go there and see what other activities we have planned for the year. And yeah, a really beautiful webinar. I love the methods discussion, the reflexivity. There's so many beautiful things, and then I can have a whole new presentation on reflecting on your amazing presentation, but that's not the time for this. So with that, thank you so much, panelists and Carlie and Stephanie, Arya and Rupinder. You were amazing. Yeah, thank you. And that's a wrap from us.
Thank you, Fatima.
Thanks so much for organizing. And thanks to everybody for being here.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.